Good morning, everybody. It's good to see more of you here on Sunday morning for Bible class. As we're getting beyond this last little wave of COVID. So we're in this study of David. We've just gotten into 2 Samuel. And last week, as we had begun, David was now king, but he was only king over Judah. You know, you've got the 12 tribes of Israel, but he's only king over Judah for 7.5 years. And so what we looked at last week in those early chapters of 2 Samuel is that there was a lot of violence going on. Joab murdered Abner. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, who is this pretend king that's been put in place, he's murdered by some guys who break into his house. They kill him in his bed. And as you read the account, David, what happens to those guys? The guys that killed Ishbosheth, thinking that they had done David a favor. David had them put to death. And if you go back and read it, it almost seems to suggest that David was extra upset at them because they had actually broken into Ishbosheth's house to kill him. Okay? So that brings us up to where we read this last week, but I just want to begin here and deal with this for a little bit today. So if you want to open your Bibles, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And it begins like this. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" So prior to this, only one of the 12 tribes recognized David as king. Okay, and that was Judah. And the other tribes recognized Ishbosheth for a short period of time as this pretend king. But after Ishbosheth is murdered, these people now, these elders of the people, they come and they turn now to David. And I want you to notice there's no crisis that has forced them to come to him. There's no pressing danger that has forced them to come to him. The Philistines aren't attacking them. The Amalekites aren't threatening them. They simply come to submit themselves to David as God's anointed king. Okay? Now, they acknowledge several important things here in just these first two verses. They say, "We are your own flesh and blood," in verse 1. Now, that's interesting and significant in that there was a period of time when David went to Philistia and he lived among the Philistines as a Philistine. But now these elders are willing to set that aside, to welcome him back, and to embrace him as one of their own. And in doing so, they acknowledge their essential unity that's rooted in one common ancestor, Jacob, whose name comes to be what? Israel. I want you to also notice that they do not say, it's interesting the wording here, they don't say, "You're one of us." They say, "We're one of you." They are now willing to see themselves as one nation rather than two. And this is going to be key to David's leadership of this united Israel. Second thing is they recognize David's leadership over them already in the past, even while Saul was king. Saul had defaulted on his responsibilities to lead the people as he should have. It was David who had led them into battle. It was David, not Saul, who had taken on Goliath. It was Not Saul, who was leading them so much as David. And these Israelite elders recognize his king-like leadership. So they're not choosing David as an unknown commodity like they had Saul. They didn't really know anything about Saul when they wanted him to be king, right? David's got a pedigree. David's got a proven track record now. And so it's totally different. David's a man who's proven himself. Third is they submit themselves to God's word as they recognize David as king. He had been publicly anointed by Samuel a long time ago, right? And Saul knew that David was going to be the next king, even though Saul tried to oppose it, right? And Abigail, you remember the issue with David and Abigail's husband? Abigail in that recognized that David was going to be the next king. And the Philistines recognized that David was going to be the next king. And I'm saying all this to say, word has gotten out, and it's all over Israel now. People know that David's going to be the next king. And these elders are recognizing that. They are acknowledging David as king in obedience to the revealed word of God. Now notice these leaders also introduce a new concept. It's one we assume because this side of Jesus, we understand what it means to be a servant leader. We understand what it means for Jesus to be our good shepherd who leads us like a shepherd leads his sheep, right? But they bring in this concept now of David's going to be a shepherd king. A shepherd king. What does that mean? Because it's easy for us to miss the significance. It's something we've just assumed. How do kings normally lead? I'm sorry? Strength, yeah. They lead from a position of strength, even bullying, oppressing, particularly in this day and time. I mean, kings they were oppressive to the people. They bullied them. And here's this king who's going to lead them in a caring way, in a kinder way. So, verse 3 then says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. They make a covenant. A covenant, it's a binding contract. A binding contract that sets out mutual obligations from both sides, responsibilities from both the king to the people as well as the people to the king. And then it says in verse 4, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. But then, in something of a paradox, this shepherd king, for the rest of the chapter, becomes a warrior king. Verse 6 says, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem. I'm trying to decide if I want to say this right now here. Well, I guess I need to now. It says Jerusalem, but it's not Jerusalem yet. The writer's writing years later, and he's reflecting back, okay? So it's not really the city of Jerusalem yet. That's not what it's known as, and I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But he marched them to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. Now, actually, at this time, Jerusalem was known as Jebus. That's why they're called the Jebusites, because they live in the city of Jebus. And it's an ancient city, and it's been known by different terms, different names. First time we come across it is in the story of Melchizedek. When Abraham comes to Melchizedek, they meet together. Who is Melchizedek? The king of Salem. And Salem was It was basically a Hebrew word for peace, and that was the name of this city at that time. Actually, the Jebusites, though, are mentioned even earlier than that. You go back to Genesis chapter 10 and verses 15 and 16, and it's there that we're told that they were the descendants of Canaan. Who was Canaan? You remember? I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but grandson. Canaan is one of Noah's grandsons. He's the son of Ham. Ham was the third son of Noah. Now, what do we know about Ham? What's a story that comes from his life that's not a good one? It says he uncovered his nakedness. Yes, his father was drunk. We don't know what goes on in this story. It could be more sordid even than that he just saw him naked. It could mean that he actually he violated his dad. We don't know exactly what the meaning of that story is, but it's just an ugly, weird story. So Ham's the one that did that. And what happens as a result? He's cursed. Not only is he cursed, but his descendants are cursed. So you've got Canaan, who is his son. Canaan becomes a nation, the nation of Canaan, the Canaanites. Well, the Canaanites, there's nobody more wicked in this time than the Canaanites are. And they're to be destroyed. So, the Jebusites are from that lineage. They're from the lineage of Canaan. This still just blows my mind every time I think about it. But when Abraham went to sacrifice his son Isaac, where did he go? Mount Moriah. If you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, Solomon builds his temple where? On Mount Moriah. So Abraham took Isaac up on the hill, really, which is later going to be Jerusalem, at the very place that Solomon is going to build his temple. That just doesn't seem right to me, but that's what Scripture tells us. So, in the book of Joshua, Jebus was described as an area that was when they divided out the land, when Joshua, they're getting ready to go in and take the land, and the land's divided up between the 12 tribes. Jebus, the city of Jebus, was given to Judah. But Judah was unable to drive the Jebusites out, we're told in Joshua chapter 15 and verse 63. But in Joshua 18 and verse 28, now it appears as if Jebus is a Benjamite city. I don't know if the tribe of Judah said, hey, we're done with that, you can have it. I don't know how all this works out, but it's now a Benjamite city. Well, it's supposed to be. It's their territory, but they can't take it over either. We're told that in Judges chapter 1 and verse 21. So what happens? Well, it leads to somewhat of a coexistence. It's like Judah and the Benjamites just say, okay, you Jebusites, you can live among us as long as you're not stirring up any trouble. And unfortunately, in fact, what was God's warning when Israel even went into the promised land if they did not destroy these other nations? What was what did he say was going to happen? They would lead them astray. They would begin to worship their gods, and that's exactly what happens. Judges chapter 3 and verses 1 to 7 tell us that. So 400 years after God had commanded Israel to take the whole land, the city of Jebus is still in Canaanite hands. This city, from ancient times, was considered to be a fortress. it was considered to be impenetrable. You even fast forward to 70 AD when Jerusalem falls, you have the Roman army, the most powerful army in the history of the world up to that point, and it takes them forever to conquer the city of Jerusalem. It's a natural fortress. It sits up on a hill. They had walls all around it, and even today, if you go there, it's got valleys that kind of surround the whole city, and they're hard to get down and get back up. So it would make it very hard for an army to attack this city. But it had a weak spot in David's time. It had a water shaft that ran through the wall that would supply them fresh water even if they were under siege. So, I think we can better understand what's going on in chapter 5 with the Jebusites if we read the next story first, and then we'll come back. So in chapter 5 and verse 6, well, I'll read this and then we'll go back. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought David can never get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. This is why they say the blind and the lame will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. And again, we'll talk about these verses more momentarily, but they can better be understood in the light that I'm wanting us to look at it if we read the next story. So the next story is when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him, but David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim, so David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" The Lord answered him, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." So David went to Baal-perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal-perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Now, I can only imagine the conversation that took place among these 5 kings of the Philistines. When they find out David is now king over a united Israel. Achish, you remember who Achish was? Achish was the king of Gath. He was the one that David had come to Gath to live. Achish had welcomed him in. He had made him a part of his army. In fact, Achish even says at one point, I'm not quoting him here, but this is basically what he says, "You'll be my right-hand man for the rest of your life." Don't you know Achish has taken it from these guys now? Why did you ever do that with him? Why did you treat him so well? And he's catching it from them. Now, it isn't difficult for us to understand why David fought against the Philistines. Because David is simply defending himself. The Philistines take the offensive. They attack Israel. They're hoping to break their backs. More specifically, they're really attacking David. why would they want to attack David? Israel's going to get more powerful. That's right, let's nip it in the bud. But who would know more about the Philistines than anyone else outside of Philistia? David knows their strategies. David knows their military strengths. David knows their methods. He knows their routes. He knows their resources. He knows everything. And so he's a formidable foe. And so, as J.D. said, better to deal with him sooner than later, after he's had time to really consolidate this nation. And so when they come against him, David has no choice but to fight this battle, right? And he beat them once. They don't get enough, so they come back. He beats them again. But the second time, he uses a different strategy. And God tells him, circle around them and come from behind. And I love that in verse 24, where he says, as soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. Yeah, does it remind you of another story, though, in the Old Testament? It reminds me of when Elijah tells Gehazi to look, and there's the chariots of fire, all around the city there to protect them. I mean, this is kind of the same thing. God says, you're going to hear this sound. Just know that's my presence. My presence is going before you into battle. I just love that. But this defeat was so bad for the Philistines. David drives them all the way back to their own territory. This is a decisive victory for David. But it's a battle he didn't choose. Now let's go back to the Jebusites. This is a battle David chooses. They weren't at war with Israel. They have this peaceful coexistence that's taking place. Again, so why did David lead all of Israel against this city? A place that Israel had never been able to take before. Let me give you a couple of reasons. One of them is that this was a city that God had promised to give the Israelites 400 years before. And their presence, as I've already said, was corrupting the people. Judges chapter 3 tells us. I think David recognized that a kingdom couldn't be viewed with respect if they could not expel its enemies from within. The Jebusites had to be dealt with, and David knew it. And it was time for the enemies of God to be defeated. That's one reason. But secondly, and this one isn't as noble, but David needed a new capital city. When he had been king of Judah alone, Hebron served just fine as a capital. Hebron is south of Jerusalem. It's down right in the middle of where the tribe of Judah was. It was very central for Judah. But now he's king of a united Israel, and so he needs to have a more central capital. It would better unify the nation, and so Jebus, well, it's just the ideal place. Again, sits atop that hill. It's a fortress, natural setting to repel attacks from. So, did you notice earlier in our reading that 3 times in that one discourse it talks about the lame and the blind? The Jebusites said that because they believed, they said that about the lame and the blind because they believed Jebus to be impenetrable. They thought there is no way in the shade of day that David and his army will be able to take our city. You know, when we feel smug, when we feel secure, it's a lot easier to talk trash, isn't it? Some of the best athletes in history have been the biggest trash talkers. They say Michael Jordan was the worst, you know. Well, when you can back it up, you can talk trash, right? And so I'm sorry, but this week when I'm looking at this, my mind went back to a movie, and many of you have seen it, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. How many of you have seen that movie? Not as many as I thought. I don't know whether to recommend it or not. It's funny, but it's goofy. Anyway, there's this one scene. King Arthur and his men come up to this castle, and it's a French castle, and there's this Frenchman up on top. And he's very cocky, and he's shouting all kinds of insults at King Arthur because he's sitting in a position that he feels very secure. And that's much like what the Jebusites are doing here. So when they see David and the Israelite soldiers coming, this isn't anything new to them, and it doesn't frighten them. In their history, these kinds of attacks have occurred fairly frequently, but nobody's ever been able to conquer the city. And so, safe behind the walls of their city, they're mocking David and his men. We can just put some lame and blind people up here and they'll be able to repel you. No big deal. It's something like us today saying, we could whip you with both hands tied behind our backs. And it served to arouse David's anger. You remember when he was a young man and Goliath's out there and coming out there every day and he's strutting around and he's cursing Israel. He's blaspheming their God. And David is ticked when he hears it. What's this uncircumcised Philistine doing talking about our God like that? Well, the same kind of thing's happening here. And he takes these words of boast that's coming from the Jebusites, and as he's giving orders to his men, he reminds them of this. It's kind of like today, and occasionally you'll hear about when two football teams are coming together, and someone on one side has said something about this team, and so the coach puts whatever they said up on the bulletin board, you know. Well, this is the same kind of thing. David's using this now against them. And so again, it says in verse 8, on that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and lame will not enter the palace. Well, what's that mean? There are actually some people who think that David's saying he's not going to allow any people who are disabled to ever come into his palace. I think that's to totally miss what David is saying here. David's using this same phrase against them. When we get finished here, there's never going to be a Jebusite step foot in my palace. So, he defeats them. The city of Jebus now becomes the city of David, which is still known as today. And Jerusalem becomes Jerusalem. So verse 11 says, now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there. Shammua, that sounds like a good name for a killer whale at SeaWorld, doesn't it? Shammua, Shobab, Nathan. You know, Nathan the prophet is going to be a very important person in David's life. and he names one of his sons Nathan. Solomon, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. Thank you. Now, if I'm dad of these kids, I'm going to be tempted to shorten some of those sons' names to Eli, but you can't do that because you'd have 3 of them looking at you every time you said it, right? So, Hiram helps David build a physical house, a palace in Jerusalem. And from what the text says, it doesn't really appear that David fully grasped the fact that he is king until he has that palace. It was like a dream for him for so long. But now God's promise has been fulfilled to him. But while he's living in this physical palace, while he's living in Jerusalem, he continues to build his house. He continues to build his family. He already had wives and kids when he was in Hebron. We looked at that last week. Now he adds more wives, more concubines, has more children. And you know what? I bet David probably thought this was a sign of God's favor on him. I have heard many times people claiming God's favor on them when it's something that's obviously wrong that they're doing. You ever heard people do that? It's so obviously wrong, and yet they're going to say, oh, look how God's blessing me. David's doing something that is wrong, in direct violation of God's will. And while he may see it as a blessing, this is going to prove to be part of his downfall. This is going to prove to be his worst nightmare. So, there's a great sense of relief and joy as he arrives at this point in his life. It's been years since Samuel had anointed him as king. He's been through a lot of painful experiences to reach this point, and it's now culminated in his reign over a united Israel. And it's a joyful moment. It's a time for celebration. So, in the time I've got left, let me sum up chapter 5 real quickly. I think we need to see this to help bring it and tie it all together, because there's an interesting thread that runs through this chapter. The theme of this chapter seems to be human beings' response to God's anointed king. Okay? While Saul and Abner and others resisted David's rise to the throne, this was God's will. And so what happened to Saul and Abner and those who opposed David's rise to the throne? They're crushed. Okay? Their leaders approach David at the first part of this chapter, and they express a desire now to submit to his kingship. And what's going to happen for them? They're going to be blessed as a result of this. And then the Jebusites, they opposed God's anointed king, and they're defeated. Hiram, the king of Tyre, he comes to David, and he helps to build him a palace. And he's going to be blessed by having a friendship with God's anointed. The Philistines, they wouldn't submit to David as king. So not once but twice, they are routed by David's army. And so you sum it up like this. Those who receive David as God's anointed king are blessed. And those who rejected David as God's anointed king are crushed. And I can't help but think that this is only a prototype, a preview of what happens with God's anointed Messiah. Okay? Jesus Messiah. I want to read to you Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, and he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. And so we might sum all this up by saying that those who receive Messiah Jesus are blessed. And those who do not will be crushed. So it's a foreshadowing of what will eventually happen through the Son, Jesus Christ. Got a few minutes? Anything you want to share? My wife is doing so well. And as I told Shirley, relatively, I mean, obviously, she's had a major surgery, but she is doing far beyond what we would have expected at this point. She's doing really well. Thank you. KC. Yeah. As are my answers to most of your questions, I don't know. But I love that you see this stuff in the text and want to know. But we don't have the answer. It may have been to make a political alliance with him. I can't remember that. But no doubt he saw some kind of favor that he might receive in doing this. But yet they do seem to have, there's an alliance that's made there. And as a result, he's not part of the consequences of David's military conquests. I can't remember for sure. Maybe they just liked each other. Maybe they liked playing golf together. I don't know. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When he's got the place, it just seems to affirm to him. Yeah, it seems to affirm in his mind, I've arrived. Yeah, that's right. Not of the Philistines. They didn't expect him to become king of the Philistines, but they expected him. They knew that he was that he was designated to be the king of Israel, to follow Saul. Mm-hmm. Good questions. Good comments. Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up then with a prayer. I just, each week I'm amazed at ways that we see you at work in these stories, things that we can learn about values, learn about the ways that we can live before you in ways that honor you. And so I'm thankful for the life of David. And